Good morning. I'm pleased to be here today, and I love this weather. Once the weather breaks, I feel like it's humane here. But I know that's because of where I grew up. I'm just not used to this kind of hot weather in the summer. My wife loves it. I think she probably belongs in a swamp or something. But it gets hot. It bothers me. So today I want to continue with a session on abortion as a moral issue. This is session 2. We're taking a kind of long wind up here, and that's intentional because I'm a little concerned with this issue, as really with most moral issues that are worth talking about, that they're more complicated than a lot of public discourse lets on. Abortion as a moral issue, session 2, mostly want to concentrate on some relevant theological themes and historical observations. But I want to start with something that's neither. Yesterday in the Washington Post, there was, I think, a good column by Leah Hochter entitled U.S. Abortion Restrictions Absolutely Do Not Align with European Law. She's advocating for more permissive laws and so forth, and she thinks that's the trend in Europe. And that argument, I think, maybe holds up. I'm not sure the word absolutely really carried the sense of the article. I think maybe she could have taken that out, or perhaps the editors could have taken that out, but who knows how that works. I've worked with editors before. I don't know if you had. They're very helpful much of the time, but not always. What she argues there is that she thinks some of these abortion restrictions that have been proposed do not align with European law. And she uses a certain vocabulary that I think is kind of interesting. So I gave you a handout. On one side it has Bible passages, and on the other side it has 2 paragraphs from her column. And I think it's worth just going through them initially here to see what we've got. She says, apart from the very few European nations that retain highly restrictive laws on abortion, he lists them. No other European country, quote, bans abortion after 15 weeks of pregnancy. Now, you want to see that the word bans is a particular word, and then we're going to have some other words coming up here. Instead, almost all allow abortion throughout pregnancy, though if you look in the next paragraph, that will be attenuated somewhat, on a range of grounds. And you want to see the range of grounds stuff here, including when there are risks to the patient's physical or mental health, and in situations involving severe or fetal impairment. Now, the next paragraph, elective abortion is only one of the grounds. And this term right here, elective abortion, that I think is a tolerably helpful term. That is, in most of these countries, there is a period of time during which a woman may elect to have an abortion without giving a reason. Okay? We okay there? And is only one of the grounds on which abortion is legal in most of Europe. And the time limits for this differ per country. So there are time limits on elective abortion. When these limits end, abortion almost always, she wants to say, remains legal for a much longer period on other grounds, but the period differs from place to place, such as broadly framed socioeconomic or health grounds or grounds of severe or fetal impairment. But at that point, it's no longer simply elective, though it is the woman's choice. You need to specify grounds. So we okay there? So you have 2 sorts of things that are being said in a number of these legal policies, and the vocabulary, I think, is worth it a little bit because the vocabulary in this country often is simply choice versus life, which is helpful in a way, but with respect to some legal policies, not as precise as a term like elective abortion and then talking about other grounds, okay? Bans is a word that, of course, is a little hard to specify exactly what it means. She argues against some of the proposals that call themselves bans, and including the one made by Senator Graham about 2 weeks ago or a week ago. Now you see she'll say in Denmark and Norway allow abortion for social, family, and economic reasons until fetal viability, which is generally, I think, thought to be 22 to 24 weeks, but they do not define when, and that is variable in terms of medical care, I think. Many European nations also include abortion in their national health insurance policies, which is to indicate that there is a broader question of health coverage and the distribution of health care that also is related to the issue. So I just wanted to start there. We'll return to that next time a little bit and try and frame a range of policies that I think might accord with some of the moral norms involved. Again, legal policies, I think, are not precisely the same thing as moral values and moral policies. They're related, but they can't be collapsed, and we'll talk about that next time, too. So I just wanted to start there. I mean, you know, it's an issue in the news, and every once in a while you get some vocabulary that's being put forth that's kind of helpful. Last time, I want to just review a little bit what we said last time. I started by saying that the question of abortion is, of course, deeply personal and passionate. And the pregnant woman is at the center of this, having to make a difficult decision. So that's something you always want to keep in mind. And you want to keep in mind that finally, when people talk about whether or not someone's going to have an abortion and so forth, it is a woman in general having to decide a difficult question. It's a moral issue, we wanted to say, where moral norms and values both differ from and relate to legal standards and social policies. This is a simple enough point. It's a traditional point, too. It's also one that Martin Luther King Jr. makes when he distinguishes between just and unjust laws. You may wonder how you make that distinction, and the answer is you make it in terms of moral discourse, and it shows that legal policies and moral norms are not exactly the same thing. This is part and parcel of an argument for civil disobedience under certain circumstances, but the same sort of distinction is also made by Thomas Aquinas and John Calvin and a whole bunch of other people. It is not late-breaking news that moral norms and legal policies are not precisely the same thing. Now, it may be late-breaking news in this country, but again, the terms of the discourse are not always the most favorable. Okay, so we have a moral issue then. In terms of Christian ethics, I wanted to say moral norms and values do in fact have an important place, as I think everyone would recognize. 10 Commandments have to do with moral values. Sermon on the Mount has to do with moral values. Nevertheless, the Christian ethics not only guide, and moral norms not only guide people in a faithful life, they also accuse. They accuse. Now, a lot of people in this country don't like that, and so they have systematically gone through worship services and elided prayers of confession and so forth. Their business, but theologically a bad idea. The idea is that the moral law is stringent. You may think you uphold it, but if we start reading the Sermon on the Mount, I bet you won't think it for long. And so the moral law guides, but it also accuses. What does this mean? In part, what this means is that we should understand ourselves as sinners who fall short and need forgiveness. And this emphasizes the importance of humility and forgiveness and so forth in moral argument and moral discourse. Again, this is a very traditional point. You've got St. Paul saying, "None is righteous, no, not one, all fall short of the kingdom and its glory." He means it. It means that if you're saved by grace alone. You may want to get used to that if you're a Presbyterian, because that is Orthodox Presbyterian theology. We do not think that your works and your moral stance saves you. In fact, if it were up to my works and moral stance, I'm in hell yesterday, okay? That's what you want to understand about this particular tradition, and it's adamant on that, and it's uncompromising on that. In any case, then, we then have a question that can come up, which is, how shall we live with dirty hands, and also recognize that there are moral tragedies in which responsible people bear some weight of unrighteousness. That is, it's not always possible to come up with, what shall we say, a happy resolution of some moral questions, and I think this is one where we have that kind of a prospect. Okay, so today we want to turn to some other stuff before we go in the third session to talk about a moral policy, a range of moral things that are relevant, and then ask which legal policies might more or less fit with it, which is a secondary but important question. Some theological themes. First one is creation. Now, creation is, it's a keeper. You don't want to let go of that in Christian theology land. And it basically means that we're creatures and God is creator, and that creation is good. And it's good because it's God's creation and it includes life. It's just pretty simple stuff here. But we want to make sure to underscore that. Creation is a good thing in Christian theology land. There have been other ways of talking about creation in the history of theology and philosophy. A number of Neoplatonic philosophers thought that life in the body was a bad deal, and that you were trapped in a material body, and that your mission, should you accept it, is to get out of the bad material body and go to the oversoul, where things are immaterial and permanent and better. This is not Christian theology land. It's sometimes worked some successful invasions occasionally with some theologians and some ideas, but if you read through the book of Genesis, this is not what's happening here. So we've got the notion that the creation is good, and we can look out here and we can see that it includes rocks, frogs, trees, and bushes, but you can also say that it includes human communities, and it includes human beings and bodies and all sorts of things. Creation, good. Okay? Good because God makes it, and it is God's donation, gift to people, including life as a gift. So what are you supposed to do when someone gives you an important gift? You see, all you got to do is remember what your mom told you when you were growing up about scratchy suits that your aunt gave you and stuff like that, which I had a couple of. You're supposed to say thank you. You may not like the suit. We can talk about the suit later, but basically, if it's a good gift, you're supposed to say thank you. So a fundamental attitude in Christian theology toward a good creation is gratitude. And part of that good creation, you and me. So we're supposed to be grateful for our possibilities, for our lives, and so forth. And incidentally, the idea that people are self-made, other than a kind of a certain cultural meaning it may sometimes have, is out the window here. I mean, that's not working, right? So creation is good, and you're supposed to have gratitude for it. The other thing that this involves is that since God's creation is good, and we need to talk about a couple other things that happen with this theological tradition, and since people have distinctive abilities to act and to manipulate things, people have distinctive responsibilities of care. So we have on the one hand gratitude and care. See, you're supposed to be more or less taking care of stuff. Now, how you take care of stuff, major issue. Exactly what that might entail changes in accordance with what you know about things and so forth. But if you ask about things like issues in environmental issues and ecology, one of the things that one wants to say is that human beings have distinctive responsibilities of care. Beavers also change Earth's environment. In fact, almost every living thing does. But even though beavers do so in a somewhat dramatic way, when you're flying over the state of Indiana and you see a checkerboard pattern in crop circles, it's not the beavers who are responsible for that. It's the people. Indiana was, in fact, you may recall, entirely covered with forests before we got there and started working on it. That's not true of some of the states further west, which had prairie grass. But in any case, the way Indiana looks from 30,000 feet is largely our responsibility. Okay, with distinctive abilities come distinctive responsibilities. In any case, we want to emphasize that creation as God's good gift is supposed to inspire gratitude and also a disposition of care. Now, what are some of the features of this creation? One is what the Bible scholars call generativity. It basically is a way of talking about be fruitful and multiply, which is a blessing given by God to creatures in their kinds in Genesis 1. Their kinds basically more roughly means their species, okay? Now, it doesn't mean quite species because they don't have modern biology, but if you think people back there were so stupid that they didn't know how to get more chickens when they had chickens, you're nuts. And they do know how to do that, and they do know that one of the marks of a kind is that it can reproduce, and it's a critical mark. So generativity is a big deal, and human beings are also given the gift of generativity. This is a big deal. And it is a good thing for which one ought to be grateful. Now, there are some ways of talking about the fall that obscure this. They're not very good ways of talking about the fall, where they decide that the fall is basically a matter of sex. There's really no indication in Genesis that that's the case. The first thing out of the blocks after the fall is basically Cain killing Abel. So if you really want to talk about some of the big consequences of the fall, you might start with murder and things of that sort. And there are a number of things that happen in the first 12 chapters of Genesis. Most of them don't have to do with sexual perversions at all. There is a little small problem about the sons of God and the daughters of men breeding and having the Nephilim, who are the great warriors of renown, and God doesn't like it. And that comes just before the flood, so God has to wipe it out after that. Too many warriors, you see? Too many John Wayne films. Okay. And you see that that's the case. But what you do have in the first chapters there is the progress of things from generation to generation. And what ties together major themes here are genealogies. You know, so-and-so begat, so-and-so begat, like that. Now, when I was in Sunday school as a kid, and we get to one of those genealogies, you sit there and think, oh no, is she going to try and make us memorize this in addition to just say it? If you ever tried to say one of them, they're pretty strange. And so I always thought genealogies were kind of bad news. You know, you got there and you're going to be in trouble. But in fact, biblically, that's not the way you're supposed to think of it. Genealogies represent the continuing blessing of generativity and life, and they represent the continuation of possibility for persons as creatures. So genealogies link almost all the really important things. So once you get through the stuff with Tower of Babel and all that, boom, you hit a genealogy, take you up to Abram. And then if you open the New Testament, somewhat by historical accident, but nevertheless it is the case, opens with the Gospel of Matthew and a genealogy that takes you up to Jesus. The genealogies represent the substratum of graceful possibility throughout the creation. God is a good God, and God creates creation as a gift, and God creates creation as a gift that has the power of generativity and reproduction in animals and plants. Big deal. Okay, so those are some biblical themes there. There are some others, passages and certain things that come up that I think mostly have to do with this theme, articulated in some ways. Psalm 139, verses 13 to 16. For it was you who formed my inward parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your eyes beheld my unformed substance. In your book were written all the days that were formed for me, when none of them as yet existed. Okay, so we have a picture here of a person being knit together in the womb, and this being something that's intentionally related to divine purpose and so forth. Jeremiah 1, chapter 1, verse 5, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you, and before you were born, I consecrated you. Okay, the focus in the Jeremiah passage is on God's appointment of Jeremiah the prophet before he was born. That's really what's going on there. It's not meant first and foremost to be a biological statement or something like that, but it has implications. And so he's appointed to be a prophet in Jerusalem before he is born. Psalm 139 is poetic, and it emphasizes that God is inescapable. So we have some further verses. Where can I go from your spirit, or where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. Verses 13 to 16. Sheol, incidentally, is not hell. It's the realm of the dead. And there are a lot of traditions that have a realm of the dead. It's a shadow kind of existence into which people go. And, you know, incidentally, when you're saying the Apostles' Creed and it says he descended into hell, the word there probably shouldn't be hell, and more like Sheol. And so you release the dead from the realm of the dead, which is a shadow place. Anyway, that's not what this class is about, but we do want to understand that Sheol here has a particular meaning. It does mean here in this psalm that God is everywhere. I mean, you can't get away. Now, when you get to the book of Job, at a certain point, Job says, look, why don't you give me a break and quit paying so much attention to me? So this has another side to it. Job wishes at points that God wasn't present everywhere and so forth. But the point is still made in these texts that God is present everywhere and is implicated in a bunch of things. The verses underscore the idea that biological formation of the individual is bound up with divine purpose, at least to some degree. Then another theme. Humans in God's image have distinctive capacities. When you go through Genesis 1, there's a reference to dominion. That is probably best understood as a kind of caretaking stewardship. The language has its limitations there. There are not but so many words in Hebrew. You're talking ancient Hebrew, which is, how shall we put this, a pretty hierarchical little language when it comes to articulating some of these things. You may be wondering why it never refers to God as a president. No one would have known anything of what you meant by that term at the time. You have kingship and things of that sort. So dominion is there, but I think you can rest assured that it never meant that God simply got the keys and tossed them to the human being and said, okay, see you later, you take care of it from now on. That is not what happens biblically. God is still always there, and you have responsibilities, but God is still involved, and you are not running the whole show. So dominion here probably has an agricultural meaning. If you go to Genesis 2, you're going to see that Adam, the human being, which is the way you should translate that, not as a proper name at the beginning. It's not that. That the human being or the earth creature is not created unemployed. He's created to till the ground, and he's got a job, and that is an agricultural job. And agriculture is one of the big indicators of the distinctive capacities of human beings in early Bible passages. Now, if you think about it, this is perfectly appropriate. It may not be so impressive to you now when you're flying a Boeing plane, but there's some similar capacities involved there. The agricultural revolution was perhaps the single greatest accomplishment technically of the ancient world. Without it, we're not here. I mean, maybe some of us are here, two, something like that. But you're not going to be able to feed them. The agricultural revolution is the reason you can feed people. It's also the reason that you have cities and sedentary settlements. You got to stay in one place. So there goes New York. I mean, you don't think of New York as farming most of the time, and you shouldn't, but there's no cities really before that. And this is what you're talking about. So agriculture is a very big deal, and you see that reflected in the first couple of chapters of Genesis there. It shows that people have dominion over what? Over the animals of the field, et cetera, is what's going to say there. But that's impressive. So what does it mean here if we keep going with this theme biblically? It means that people have significant technical and other abilities. It also means they are significantly self-directing. Now, I use the term self-directing rather than the word autonomous because autonomous has a certain kind of technical meaning in later Western philosophy that is perhaps overly grandiose from a biblical perspective. But self-directing works out pretty well. You have something to do with who you become, and you are responsible for a lot of the stuff that you do. And you have certain characteristics and characteristic abilities and so forth. Are you autonomous in the sense that you can determine who you shall be? In Christian theology land, we want to calm down about that because there are an awful lot of features to you that are given and in place that you can't really alter, but we'll worry about that another day. In any case, they are significantly self-directing. And so respect for self-directing persons, for instance, contrasts with the oppressions of slavery in Egypt in the story in Exodus, which is a big deal. The oppressions of slavery in Egypt in turn also contrast, or meant to contrast in the story, with the establishment of Israel as a nation or society with its own tolerably just laws. And so that is the story of Exodus 1 through 20. And if you get to the beginning of the Ten Commandments and don't make the same mistake that the state of Texas did when it put them in stone on the grounds of its state capital, you begin with, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, you shall have no other gods before me. You don't just start with, you shall have no other gods before me. An American mistake. The first part, that God did something for you, part of the story, is critical of the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments don't just drop out of the sky one day because, hey, I'm God and you better follow them. They are meant to be the basis for a good life together, for a people that is no longer a bunch of slaves, but are their own nation, and have a modicum of justice. Okay, we can ask questions about the law, whether or not we think it's entirely just in all of the ways that it's articulated, But it is meant to be in contrast with the oppressions of slavery in Egypt, which incidentally include an order from Pharaoh for midwives to kill all the male children born to the Israelites, if you recall. And other things too, more brick without straw, things like that, as a portrait of oppression. Okay, so we have then the establishment of Israel as a nation or society with its own tolerably just laws. This is a story in Exodus 1 through 20. And it raises the question of persons and justice and fairness. And one of the things involved in talking about fairness and justice is the recognition that people are, within certain limits, self-directing. There are other questions too. That is, can they be vulnerable, etc., and we'll talk about some of those, but this is the law. So you've got this also as a theme, biblically and theologically. Care for the weak and dependent. This is a big one. It's a value emphasized at important points in the law of Israel, and just to make sure we got that point, I did bring along my Bible here. So this is Exodus 22. This is not the Ten Commandments per se. These are features of the law of Israel that follow it. I just want to read you a couple of verses. You shall not wrong or oppress a resident alien, for you are aliens in the land of Egypt. You shall not abuse any widow or orphan. If you do abuse them, when they cry out to me, I will surely heed their cry. My wrath will burn, and I will kill you with the sword, that is in war. And your wives shall become widows, and your children orphans. It's pretty direct, really. If you lend money to my people, to the poor among you, you shall not deal with them as a creditor. You shall not exact interest from them. If you take your neighbor's cloak and pawn, you shall restore it before the sun goes down. For it may be your neighbor's only clothing to use as cover. In what else shall that person sleep? And if your neighbor cries out to me, I will listen, for I am compassionate. The point, this is not the Ten Commandments now. This is the civil law of Israel, and you don't have to follow civil laws of Israel. I mean, most of the theological tradition is going to tell you that. You don't have to model your laws in Denmark today on ancient Israel's laws. We're okay here. On the other hand, they're not irrelevant, and they do express certain values, and you can see here that things don't always become more caring as a legal matter as you go forward. A resident aliens does mean immigrants. That's what it means. Okay. And you see also there a reference to the Exodus, that is getting out of Egypt, which is the fundamental saving event for Israel. And so the treatment of resident aliens and the vulnerable is always linked to that event. And when something gets linked to that event in Hebrew scriptures, it's a big deal. It's not going away. So we have that here, care for the weak and dependent, and you can expand that to talk about, and we can talk about different groups of persons as weak and dependent. This involves what some moral theologians call the quartet of the vulnerable, and the quartet of the vulnerable are the poor, the widow, the orphan, and the stranger within your gates. So there you go for that. And that will be repeated like a refrain through a lot of Hebrew scriptures. I mean, where half of American Protestantism gets its ideas politically on these sorts of things is another question entirely, but this is not what we're talking about today. And today we're simply talking about what a couple Bible passages say. We'll leave it to these happy Protestants to figure out what they mean later, okay? But sometimes it's pretty direct. And in any case, care for the vulnerable is a feature of the message of the kingdom. And Jesus' message of the kingdom. Jesus doesn't go back on this. He intensifies it. And so you have the healing of the sick, receiving children, blessing the poor, helping those in need, and so forth, as you have in the story of the Good Samaritan, and those sorts of things. So Jesus intensifies and expands this kind of care for the weak and dependent. These themes then are relevant when we turn to the question of abortion in a variety of different ways. What sorts of things? For example, and this is not all of the relevance, the fetus can be regarded as weak and dependent. Okay? That's a possible thing to do. Women can be regarded, and ought to be regarded, as agents whose self-direction may be inappropriately curtailed or oppressed. It's an easy thing to do out of Christian theology land. The hard thing to do is to figure out how to work these things at the same time. Okay, consider another passage now, Exodus 21, 22 to 25. And there I've given you three translations of it on a piece of paper here. And we should just go through those. This passage is one place where the question of miscarriage and so forth is directly addressed, although it is not addressed in the context that we're considering here of abortion as a moral issue. New Revised Standard Version. When people who are fighting injure a pregnant woman so that there is a miscarriage, and yet no further harm follows, the one responsible shall be fined what the woman's husband demands, paying as much as the judges determine. If any harm follows, that is, not to the fetus, to the woman, then you shall give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. Okay, that's the NRSV. The New International Version, NIV. If people are fighting and hit a pregnant woman and she gives birth prematurely, and you see that's a different phrase than there is a miscarriage. You will also notice that there is an E next to that, because the translators tell you that E means that gives birth prematurely may very well mean has a miscarriage, which would be the same translation as you've got in the previous one. But there is no serious injury. You see here, we don't, the fetus, there could be a live baby. See, that's possible on that translation. The offender must be fined whatever the woman's husband demands and the court allows. But if there is serious injury, you are to take life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, etc. So those are two different translations. And here's a third, Common English Bible, which is used pretty widely by some scholars now. When people who are fighting injure a pregnant woman so that she has a miscarriage, but no other injury occurs. So trying to be clear there. Then the guilty party will be fined what the woman's husband demands as negotiated with the judges. If there is further injury, then you will give list again. Now, one question here is whether this passage is distinguishing between the adult woman as a self-directing agent or person and the fetus. This is a question that you can raise here, the way it's done. In terms of the translations, you don't have to go by me, but I think that the NRSV and the Common English Bible have it about right, and you see also that the New English Version wants to say that, yeah, it probably is about right with that, the note that it has after gives birth prematurely. So you've got some questions here that can be raised about this. Let me just say a couple of things first. Again, this is civil law in Israel. It is not moral law per se. It is related to moral values, but it's not the same. John Calvin does not think that in Geneva they have to reduplicate the civil law of Israel. They are going to come up with their own civil law in Geneva, thank you very much, and they are going to try and be informed by moral norms, etc., some of which are biblically connected, but they're going to do it another way, and they're going to come up with different ideas on things like lending money at interest, etc., like that, and he will argue for that. So it is not the case that ordinarily in Christian theology land you simply say that the civil laws of Israel need to be reduplicated. You know, if you can just think about that. It would be a heck of a move if you did it. Would you like a king, or perhaps judges? This is not something that has been generally argued. But it doesn't mean that the civil law means nothing. So it does mean something, but it's hard to know exactly what it means. Plus you have a difference over translation here. There are some other things to ask about this passage, and some others like it. One is just the question of the ambiguities in the status of women, and you see them reflected here also in this passage, right? The offender must be fined whatever the woman's husband demands and the court allows. You see, at a certain point, the woman is regarded largely as secondary and to some extent degree property with respect to the husband. That's what's going on here. Now, it's property of a certain sort, and you want to don't get too excited. It's not saying a woman is like, a household implement or something, and there are penalties and so forth, and it works out differently. And the law is a pretty variegated thing. Nevertheless, it is the case that women are put in a secondary position here, and to some extent degree regarded as property. Right? You want to see that. On the other hand, it is also true that if you kill a woman, you can be liable to a death penalty. Now, and that's not the same thing as if you kill an ox. Okay, well, we okay here? We're just trying to exposit what's here. And it's important to tarry a little bit as we do so, because people come up with these incendiary little ideas once in a while that are basically based on not reading things very carefully. But that's not a surprise, I don't think. Okay. So we've compared the translations, and we've also seen that the husband's ownership is prominent here. So we have a kind of a problem with respect to some of these texts which have to do with how women are being regarded as self-directing agents. It is also, of course, the case that when women are not regarded as self-directing agents, one of the consequences in some of the ancient societies is they are thought to have an obligation or expectation to bear children, whether they want to or not. Okay, here, so we just want to be perfectly clear about this kind of stuff and see where it gets us. It may not get us far, but we want to be clear. Okay. So we've compared the translations there, and we've seen the stuff about civil law. You want to understand that when you come up with things in the Bible, just because Hebrews did them doesn't mean that Christian tradition, by and large, is arguing that you should, okay? This is not late-breaking news, all right? Medieval people were medieval, but they weren't idiots. You want to keep this in mind. And if you think that we're smarter than everyone else because we're here now, well, let's go back to the window. How's it going? We're so damn smart. Now, it turns out that if you have a position that says just because you're alive you're smart and dead people are stupid, that's not very helpful. But it also turns out if you think that dead people are always right because they're dead and they're authoritative, this is also perhaps not very helpful. You're just going to have to talk this over. There's no way out of this. Okay. So we have that kind of thing going on. But we see these different things, and I'm not here to tell you to reduplicate the law of Israel. On the other hand, I do think that the law of Israel with respect to resident aliens and widows and orphans, we might want to think about that a little bit. It looks like it may be a little more humane than our own. Okay, that's another argument. Now a sort of general question here. The practice of exposing children in some ancient societies. It turns out that this is not uniform in ancient societies, but it's done with some frequency. So the practice of exposing children means when someone is born, you can take the baby and leave it out, right, in the wilderness or something, and that's that. Now this turns out to have been a practice in a number of ancient societies in the Mediterranean. Turns out to have been a practice with a number of Native American tribes and societies in this country and so forth. It's not a unique thing. It's not being done all the time, but it's done with some frequency. Children are set out to die. Sometimes they're directly killed for a variety of reasons. What are the reasons? Why does someone do that in the ancient world? Probably, best we can figure out, and very often there are economic reasons. There are also cultural reasons about whether you prefer having a male or a female child. Of course, that also probably eventually relates to economic reasons and cultural reasons that can be expanded upon. But you have those sorts of practices. That was done in a number of societies. Often it was not, and also then set out because of physical malformations. Right? Now, often this was not regarded as murder. Why? The idea was that babies babies were not fully human persons until sometime after their birth. So then you have different ways of testing for that in some of these ancient cultures, and one of them is to get a shiny object and see if the baby follows it with its eyes, and that doesn't happen right away. So you've got this sort of thing said. Now, I want to be clear here. The reason why the children are being exposed is not because people think they may not be fully human. The reasons why are economic and otherwise. But a semi-justification, a moral idea, is that they're not fully human. Okay? And that's something done with some frequency there. You want us to see this done in a number of different places. I think probably we should ponder the economic plights of many people in ancient societies. It's not a happy circumstance a lot of the time. When you're reading through, look, there's a lot of economic hardship in the contemporary world, and some of it probably rivals the ancient world pretty extraordinarily. But if you want to think of something like village life in northern Egypt, like in the 2nd century or something like that, this is not something that you or I are likely to want to take up anytime soon. This is not an economically helpful little thing. It is a lot of hard work, and there are all sorts of difficulties, and you have different practices that people engage in. They also have limited options available to them for a number of different things. But we want to consider that. Nevertheless, I think it's probably true that we find the practice, generally, of exposing born children abhorrent. Now, why would we find it abhorrent? And part of the reason, I think there's a bunch of reasons, but one is we have knowledge of the biological and perceptual development of humans and infants and so forth that they end. And that's one of the things. It's going to make it difficult. So, increased knowledge scientifically does not always lead you to more permissive policies. Are we okay here? Right? We want to say that. We want to understand that that's the case. And this is a tough one here. I'm not sitting here telling you that we should now make a cottage industry of sitting in judgment over people in northern Egypt or something in the 2nd century. I have no interest in doing that. I drove over here in my Toyota pickup truck after having a nice breakfast where I made a little espresso out of the Ottati machine on my electric range, and I had a nice cup of coffee before I came over here. You think I could have done that in 2nd century England? I don't think so. I don't think I'd be as happy this morning in many respects. And there are other things that are involved here, like there are people who decide to become monks and so forth at that point, largely because they can swear off living in those villages and having families. It's a topic from another. I do want to understand that. All right. Our Bible passages also indicate the subservient position of women in many societies, including ancient Israel. This is a position often linked with the expectation and requirement that they bear children, and that they bear children is a valuable thing for the husbands, etc. And this expectation and this subservient position runs afoul of contemporary moral convictions about respecting women as agents, that is, self-directing persons. And so that's also the case. Now, what I understand is that today there is a congregational meeting at 10:40. And so what we want to do now is just talk over what we got. Next time, I promise to begin to lay out a ballpark set of positions here and relate them to some legal policies and things of that sort. I do want to keep in mind some of the vocabulary that you see in that article I mentioned at the beginning here, which I think will be of some help to us in trying to formulate positions. The position I'll try and formulate, I will etc. And, you know, the idea that you just hang around as sort of therapeutically inclined individuals and make your own decisions has its own shortcomings, as we now know, in contemporary Western societies. But these are differences that are out there, and they are important things to try and keep in mind, and they bear upon issues like this pretty directly and severely. I don't know what to say about, you know, sort of international policy in these regards. You know, there are different cultures in the world. I don't think you want to simply turn into a complete relativist. And on the other hand, you know, to really require that all cultures be just like your own has a kind of bad ring to it, I think. So this is one of the major problems that you've got in the contemporary world. You've got it also historically.
The word value in the text is talking about a fine, and insurance companies, if somebody in this room runs me over one of these crosswalks here, or runs over my 30-something-year-old son, the judgment's going to be different, you know, in terms of the value of my life versus the younger person's life, and that sort of thing. And so this economic kind of thing is codified in a lot of ways in cultures. The thing I struggled with when I worked in East Africa was a finite resource decision the chief of the hospital had to make. And he had some sort of new gift. Does he spend it on a hemodialysis unit or a neonatal unit? He wanted to spend it on a hemodialysis unit. And then, as an American, I think there's this child hierarchical change in terms of the value that we have, and I'm not talking about dollars and cents so much as sort of another way of looking at value. We've elevated children here in a unique sort of way, and it probably plays into this whole European-American difference that we begin the class with. Is I think as Americans we have children on pedestals that they don't have in other cultures.
Could be, up to the point where we fund education, I think. But I agree. I mean, I think that there are judgments being made all the time in different ways in cultures. And to think that it's not only other cultures that assign economic value to people at different stages in life and so forth. We do it too. Now, we don't always do it exactly the same way, in the same occasions, with the same things. And then the question of value to children, I think, is important. But I think the stuff with European and American stuff, I mean, the difficulties there go to, do we distribute medical care as thoroughly for children and education stuff? And so I think you end up having debates about how children are being regarded. But, you know, you can say that historically, the status of children is always a sort of big question. Why? I mean, because it can be. You know, if you try and turn the status of the rich and the powerful in your country into a really questionable thing, you've got hell to pay. No one's doing that, right? You could ask, you know, incidentally, why you don't draft people who are 33. There are reasons for that, and there's hell to pay. I think perhaps President Putin is about to find out. But you have these sorts of things in the world. And so we don't want to say that we alone have escaped without assigning a monetary value to persons. We do it. Now, I don't think when we do it, we're necessarily saying, and that's the only thing that's relevant about the loss or something like that. But, you know, there are limits as to what you can redress legally and kind of do it. And, you know, a few bucks is important. I don't say that, but it's not everything. And sometimes, you know, you lose something in God's word, and that's a tough thing to do. I think it's all really important points.
Thank you.
We will keep going with this next week. We'll see if we can have a little fun even in the face of a difficult issue, but what we want to do is keep in mind that there are many different facets to the